So let's go into a little more depth of the last sort of three stages of the Marxist concept of history, this transition from capitalism, socialism, communism. We're going to focus on different aspects of these three systems, and then we'll talk in depth about Marx's concept for how this transition takes place. So we're going to fill out this table. We're going to discuss each of the three systems and then what property looks like, what profits look like, how goods are produced and allocated, and what labor looks like under each of these three systems. So the first one let's talk about is capitalism. We should be most familiar with this, I would say, because it's the economic system that we live every second of every day of our lives. So what does property look like under capitalism? Property is owned by private individuals. This one's pretty self-explanatory. In our capitalistic system, you as an individual can own private property. But really what we're talking about here is capital assets. A capital asset is an asset itself that can generate capital. So it can generate a profit on its own. So examples of this would be like a business, real estate if the market is increasing, cash itself if you invest it or put it in a bank account and it gains interest as a capital asset. Stocks and bonds that you might purchase are capital assets. Those types of things are capital assets. Things that are not capital assets but that are still property are things like a pencil or a piece of paper or your clothing or perhaps your computer, your television, those types of things. In a capitalistic system, you get to own all of those things, capital assets and non-capital assets. So what do capital gains look like in a capitalistic society? Think of this as profit. What does profit look like? Profit accrues to those private individuals that own the capital assets. So in a capitalistic system, you get to own the capital assets and you also have rights to the profits that that capital asset generates. So if you own a home and over time it increases in value and you sell that home, you as an individual that owns that home are entitled to the profits of that asset. Same as if you yourself as an individual own a business, you are entitled to the profits of that business. Pretty simple there, I think. How are goods and services produced and allocated in a capitalistic system? Goods are produced and distributed according to the price mechanism, and this is supply and demand. We're not going to go into in-depth economic lecture about the supply and demand curves and what that looks like, but just in really simplistic sense, know that if you are a capitalist in a capitalistic society, and let's say that you own a business, how are you going to decide what to produce? The simple answer is you're going to produce whatever there is a demand for, right? So if people want something, you will produce that thing. And sometimes you may even produce a good and then generate the demand for it. Think like Henry Ford and the automobile. It didn't exist before. He produced it and then he also produced the demand for that good. So when you're deciding how to price a good that you have produced, that is also based on demand, right? So if there's incredible demand for a product, you can demand an incredibly high price. If there's not a lot of demand, you'll have a really much lower price. So a really simplistic version, that's how we decide what to produce and how much to sell it for and how to allocate it in a capitalistic society based on demand of that good. So what does labor look like in a capitalistic society? Labor is purchased and sold for money wages. Labor itself is a capital asset. You as an employee possess a capital asset that is your labor. And your employer or the owners of businesses, etc., they can purchase that capital asset from you for a set price. So let's say you get paid $15 an hour. You have agreed to sell your labor for that hourly wage, and your employer has agreed to purchase that capital asset from you hourly for that set amount. When you think about it in this context, think about how there is, in very real terms, some set price that you are willing to sell yourself for, right? You've decided that's $15 an hour or $10 an hour or whatever that is, and the labor value in capitalistic society also follows the supply and demand model. So if there's an incredible supply of labor, high unemployment, then wages will be low because there's a lot of employees to choose from, and there will be competition between those employees for work. If there's hardly any available labor, or let's say you own a business that needs really, really specialized technical talent, you might have to offer a higher wage for that because there's not as much of a supply. So in a capitalistic system, labor itself is a capital asset. Let's quickly go through some different versions of capitalism just so we get an idea of different systems and how they look, because not all capitalistic societies are the same. So the first one, let's talk about free market capitalism. Free market capitalism refers to an economic system where prices for goods and services are set freely by the forces of supply and demand and are allowed to reach their point of equilibrium without intervention by government policy. So free market is exactly that. Completely free, no kind of outside influences, no government intervention. The prices are allowed to set themselves and reach this point of equilibrium based purely on consumer behavior and supply and demand. A social market version of capitalism is a nominally free market system where the government intervenes in price formation, but that's kept to a minimum, and the state provides significant services in the area of Social Security, unemployment benefits, recognition of labor rights, etc. So this is a free market plus some type of social intervention on by the government. So they might intervene in creating some kind of price guidelines, but that's kept to a minimum. But they do provide some basic social services like unemployment, Social Security, maybe some basic social welfare, that type of thing. So that's a social market economy. Let's talk about state capitalism. State capitalism consists of state ownership of the means of production, so state ownership of capital assets, and the state enterprise, the government, is a commercial profit-seeking business. So the state actually owns in state capitalism the capital assets, and they operate as a regular corporation to generate profit. This one is close to socialism, and we'll talk about the differences when we get there. Next, we have corporate capitalism. Corporate capitalism is a free or mixed market characterized by the dominance of hierarchical, bureaucratic corporations. So corporate capitalism is a capitalist system that is made up largely of huge corporations that manage the economy. And finally, these aren't all the versions of capitalism, these are just a few. The last one we're going to discuss is a mixed economy, which is largely market-based, private and public ownership of the means of production, and economic interventionism through macroeconomic policies is intended to correct market failures, reduce unemployment, and keep inflation low. So this is basically a combination of all of the others. In the United States, we most have a mixed economy. Most capital assets are owned by private individuals, but some are owned by government institutions. As an example, Colorado Springs is a good example. The utilities company in Colorado Springs is owned by the people. It's owned by the government. So that's a capital asset, but it's owned by the government. The government absolutely, in the U.S. version of capitalism, intervenes in the market, usually through things like subsidies and tax breaks, those types of things to provide benefits for certain corporations to manage the market and manage prices, in theory to try to prevent any catastrophic failure, though it has some other impacts, but that's beyond the scope of this lecture. So that's really capitalism in a nutshell and some different versions of capitalism. We have in the US mostly a mixed economy. So let's go into socialism. In socialism, there are two types of property: personal property and private property. Personal property is owned by individuals, and this is non-capital assets. Private property, which are capital assets, that is owned by the state. So if we're using our examples of property, things like a pencil and paper and your clothing and laptop and things, your television, things that are not capital assets, those are personal property under socialism. So you can own those things, but anything that can generate a profit is owned by the government, the quote-unquote state. And this is a good time to explain this term here when we're talking about Marxism. Normally when we think of the state, it's this really kind of oppressive and ominous sort of government we typically think of, but for Marxism, think of the state as being all of us equally. All of the people make up the state. So don't think of it as this sort of scary thing. Think of it as we all equally, as the citizens of society, own all of the capital assets in this context. So capital assets under socialism are owned by all of us collectively. As far as profits go, the goal in a socialistic society, at least in the Marxist version, is to eliminate capital gains, to get rid of profits altogether. This is really why it's key that this is a transition phase. So in socialism, we're trying to sort of phase out profit. And so you ask yourself, why would we do this? Why would we get rid of profit in our economy? Well, if we look back to the first box for socialism, private property, the capital assets are all owned by us equally. So if the capital asset is generating a profit, we're essentially exploiting ourselves because we own that corporation. So the thinking here is, why would we want to generate a profit when we ourselves are paying for that profit? So as an example, let's say the United States was a socialistic economy. We as the people would all equally own Apple. And if that's the case, let's say hypothetically I'm pulling this number just off the top of my head. Let's say it costs $100 to make an iPhone, but an iPhone costs $700. There's $600 of profit there. So in a purely socialistic society, let's say we're operating at a profit, and I buy an iPhone and I pay $700, but it only costs $600. At the end of the year, in theory, I should get that $600 back. All of the profit of the company should go back and be split up amongst all of the equal owners of that company, which would be all of us as citizens. So the thinking is, why would we even generate that profit? Let's just charge everyone in the beginning whatever the thing costs to make. So I would just pay $100 for my iPhone, and there would be no profit in the system. Going back to our example of Colorado Springs Utilities, in theory, this is sort of how this works, and how it works in real world terms is we pay a certain rate for our utilities, and the next year, if profit has existed and we all basically paid slightly too much for our utilities, then the next year there will be a rate adjustment and the rate should go down, and essentially we will get that profit back through our cheaper utility rates for the second year. It obviously doesn't work that simply in the real world, but that's the idea. The goal is to get rid of profit, because if we all own the capital assets, then we shouldn't have to pay that profit. We should just pay whatever those things cost. This is where socialism differs from a state capitalism. In state capitalism, the capital assets are owned by the state, but they're operated intentionally to generate a profit. That is not the case in socialism. The goal is to get rid of profit altogether. In socialism, goods are produced according to use value. Use value is basically the value that something has in your life, nothing more and nothing less. This is the utility of consuming and using that good. So this is kind of interesting because let's say a car, right? How much use value does your car have? Depending on the city that you live in or the country that you live in, it probably has a lot of use value, right? It gets you to and from work, it gets you to and from school, it gets you to the grocery store and to run other errands and drive your friends and right, all these things. So it has a use value. So in a purely socialistic society, they might produce a car that is inexpensive, that can function for the vast majority of society, and that would have a really high use value, and it would be inexpensive and everyone can afford it, and it would serve the function of really making society operate more efficiently. In a socialistic society, though, we would never have a supercar, right? We would never have a Bugatti Veyron or Lamborghinis or Ferraris or on, because the use value of that is not any more than a regular car. So why would we produce this thing that costs much, much more to make than just a standard car? So in a socialist society, we might have the choice between 3 cars or something like that, right? A small, tiny 4-door that the vast majority of people would have, maybe some type of van that large families and large groups of people and maybe like delivery drivers would have, and perhaps a truck for people that need to that work construction and that need to haul things and whatever. So we might have those types of vehicles, and those might be our only options in a socialistic society. We don't need Ferraris, we don't need Lamborghinis. on, because we only need the use value for that thing. So we're going to produce the things that are the most useful. A couple of examples actually throughout history of this that are kind of interesting this is, if you know what the term Volkswagen actually means in German, it's people's car. And in World War II, around this era, Hitler actually commissioned the creation of the Volkswagen, and this was going to be his really utilitarian car for the masses. It was the people's car. So it was going to be inexpensive and reliable, and everyone could afford it, and as a result, society and the economy would function much more efficiently when everyone had efficient and cheap transportation. Another example most of you probably haven't heard of or don't remember is the Yugo. This was in the 1980s in Yugoslavia, which was a quote-unquote communist. It was really a socialist country. The state made this vehicle called the Yugo that was really, really inexpensive, really, really cheap, and the idea was that it was to provide transportation for all of the citizens of Yugoslavia. They turned out to be pretty big pieces of junk, and it's rare that you would ever see one anymore, but you can go and look up the Yugo, and you'll see an example of attempt at doing this in a society. Goods are allocated based on the law of value. So before in capitalism, the price mechanism decides what the price of things are going to be. In socialism, in the Marxist version of socialism, goods basically, quote unquote, cost whatever it takes to make that product. Any labor, any raw materials, anything like that, whatever goes into that product, that is the law of value, and that's how much it's going to cost. So let's say, like I said, it takes $100 to produce an iPhone, and that's everywhere from the mines that are mining the rare elements and the labor that goes into that, to the labor in the lab of creating the processor, to the labor of actually putting all the pieces together and assembling the phone and making the glass and shipping it to the retailer, on and on. All of those things go in, and let's say that goes into that, our hypothetical $100. So in a socialistic society, that phone would cost us $100. No more, no less. Goods are allocated based on this law of value, the value of the labor and the raw materials that go into producing that good. If you are know anything about accounting, this is your costs of goods sold. This is the COGS, the costs that go into manufacturing a product. What does labor look like in a socialistic society? Labor exists based on the needs of society. So if we are producing things that have a high use value, the labor will be allocated to produce those things, and really nothing more and nothing less. The key here is, and the difference between this and capitalistic society is the end of exploitation. So we are all exploited in a capitalistic society, right? If we look at the box above this one, we see that labor is purchased and sold for money. Wages in a capitalistic society, like we said, let's say you decided your labor is worth $15 an hour and you found some employer that's willing to pay you $15 an hour. You make more than $15 an hour for that company. Let's say, just hypothetically, that every hour that you are working, you generate $20 an hour. So you are generating $5 of profit for this company, right? This is all hypothetical. They're paying you 15 of that 20 and they're pocketing the remaining 5. This is exploitation. You are being exploited, right, for your labor. They're only paying you a portion of what your labor is actually worth to the company. They should be paying you the whole 20 if they weren't exploiting you. So that $5 is $5 of exploitation, and that is profit that they are generating. But in a socialistic economy, if our goal is to eliminate profit, then we no longer will exploit the employees. Let's say they generate $20 of profit for the company every hour. They will get paid $20 because we are trying to eliminate profit. We don't need that additional $5 to go to the company. We're eliminating profit. All this is really simplistic, obviously, but this is how it works in really simplistic terms. So we are ending exploitation. You will get paid exactly the amount of revenue that you generate for a company in any given hour. So if you generate $10 an hour, that's what you will get paid. If you generate $20 an hour, that's what you will get paid. There is no exploitation in a socialistic society. Now let's fill in the boxes here for communism. Private property is abolished. All property is owned by the state. So we no longer have two types of property here in a communistic system. Now, all property is abolished. Everything is owned by the state being all of us equally. So there's no personal property, there's no public property, right? All property is owned by the state. So you might ask yourself, well, I was able to digest socialism when capital assets would be owned by the state, but this seems a little extreme that all property is owned by the state, including my laptop and my computer and my shirt and my pencil and my paper. But the thinking goes that if everyone basically has everything that they need, then I'm never going to come to you and say, hey, give me my 300 millionth of your shirt that I own, or I now want to take from you the 300 millionth of the laptop, your laptop that I own, right? That type of thing, because I have my own shirt and I have my own laptop and I don't need yours. So it's not a big deal that we all own each other's property sort of communally, because we all have enough that we need. So we don't need to go out and take anyone else's. This is all theoretical, right? Capital gains are completely eliminated. So the goal in socialism is to get rid of profit. By the time we get to pure communism, that has occurred. So we no longer have profit. We've now worked out all of the economic systems to where we no longer need to charge $700 for the iPhone. We can now charge $100, and that's it. And there's no profit, no exploitation of labor, etc. Goods are produced and allocated according to a master plan. So there is a master plan that exists within society, and we produce and allocate things based on that master plan, based on what everyone needs and how much everyone can work, and on and on. So there's this comprehensive, overarching economic plan that is created, and goods are produced and allocated according to this plan. So the plan would include things like we need to produce X number of cars this year, we need to produce X pounds of corn and pounds of sugar, and think of any good that you can think of. We need this many iPhones and this many laptops, and on and on and on. So goods will be produced according to this master plan. Labor also exists according to this plan. So we would know that we need, hypothetically, we need 100,000 vehicles that we need to produce this year. So let's get enough labor to staff the factory to produce 100,000 vehicles. We want to produce 10 million iPhones. We will fill the factory with enough people and enough labor to produce that number of iPhones. No exploitation is taking place still at this point. That's important. So the labor exists based on this master plan. So no longer are you out there trying to find a job and what am I going to do? It's, okay, we have this master plan. This is your skill set. This is where you will be appointed to work. You're an engineer that works in telephone design. You're going to go work in the factory to produce the smartphones for everyone in our economy. You don't have to go out and search for a job. You don't have to do all these things. This is where you are appointed to work according to the master plan. Often the question I get is, who makes the master plan? It seems incredibly complicated. Yes, of course, Marx never gives us those answers. So we don't have a concrete answer for who are the specific people that would generate the master plan in theory. And if we look at some countries that have attempted this, like the Soviet Union and things like that, we would have groups of economists and leaders that would deal with coming up with this master plan. But the interesting thing is we have thus far looked at communism as an economic system. It also is a system of a social system, just like we talked about the different systems of stratification. But in communism, there is no stratification. Communism is all about equality. So I mentioned we will have a group of economists that come up with a master plan. In our capitalistic way of thinking, we would think, wow, well, those people have incredible power because they are basically dictating what we're going to produce and consume for everyone in society. But in communism, they wouldn't want to exploit that power, and that's the key. They would have this power to create this system, but they wouldn't create it in a way to benefit themselves. They wouldn't create it in a way to exploit other people. They would create it in a way to maximize the efficiencies of society and maximize the benefit for everyone in society. I know that's a little hard for us to digest because we obviously have lived our entire lives in a capitalistic society, and Marx argues that it would take a while for us to make this transition into communism. In fact, at times it might even require us to go into multiple generations and people that have never lived in a capitalistic system, society, in order for us to get to this final version of communism.